Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I am John Boyer. I appreciate the Stakeholder Advisory Group participants' interest in attending today's webinar, which focuses on river and reservoir management in the Catawba and Yadkin Basins. We have two speakers today, Tammy Steyer and Lynn Dunn of Duke Energy. Tammy is a senior project manager in the Water Strategy, Hydro Licensing, and Lake Services Group in Duke's Regulated and Renewable Energy Department. Tammy graduated from UNC Charlotte in 1984 with a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering and has been working at Duke Energy for 41 years. Tammy joined the Hydro Licensing team in 2005, and she is currently the Licensing Project Manager for the Catawba Watery Hydro Project. Tammy's had an incredible career with Duke Energy, and she is retiring, believe it or not, in 2.5 days. So she's leaving the group in good hands with Dr. Brett Hardis as a replacement, and is looking forward to spending lots of time with her family and friends. I'm imagining, Tammy, this is probably your final presentation of your career, so congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, it is.
Yep. Our second speaker is Lynn Dunn. Lynn is a senior generation program manager in regulated renewables hydro operations. Lynn graduated from UNC Pembroke in 2014 with a Bachelor's of Science in Business Management and in 2023 with a Master's of Business Administration. Lynn's worked for Duke Energy for 23 years. She began her career with Duke as a hydroelectric power plant operator and currently manages the FERC operations compliance for Duke Energy's fleet of hydro projects in the Carolinas. There are a few housekeeping items I'd like to review before today's webinar. Again, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted to the Charlotte Water IBT website for later viewing. Participants will be muted throughout the webinar. You will not have the ability to turn on your camera. The chat feature should be available. We generally like you to hold your questions until the end, but if you have any questions about the specific content presented, feel free to add your question to the chat or raise your hand. Jennifer Frost and I will be moderating the chat session, and we will relay questions to the speakers at an appropriate time. You can also use the chat to report any problems with audio or other accessibility issues. If you have questions that are not related to today's content, please submit those to ibtproject@charlottenc.gov, or you can email them to me and I will work with Jennifer and the Charlotte Water team to address them. At our next SAG workshop, we'll be happy to address questions about the IBT process and anything related to it. Before I turn it over to Angela Charles for a brief introduction, I wanted to remind everyone of the upcoming webinars and workshops. Our third webinar is still scheduled for Wednesday, April 23rd. Linwood Peel of Division of Water Resources will be presenting on IBT process and regulations. There are some additional webinars that we're planning to potentially cover topics such as hydrologic modeling and the proposed alternative screening analysis process. Tentatively, we're still planning on the next SAG workshop to be held in late May, and we hope to firm up a date in the coming weeks for that. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Angela Charles, the Director of Charlotte Water. Angela?
Thanks. Can you guys hear me okay, John?
We can.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. And I want to begin by thanking you for your engagement and participation on our stakeholder advisory group. So I'm loving how these webinars are shaping up. Today we have river and reservoir management for the Catawba and Yadkin Basins. And I just think that is, I think that's so important and very good information for to be shared with everyone. So thank you for your engagement. Please, take notes, and because I think we're just in for an exciting update this afternoon. So John, I'm going to punt it back over to you and we'll just keep going. Thanks again, everyone.
Sure. Thank you, Angela. With that, I'll turn it over to Tammy. Tammy, you have control.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so as John and Angela have mentioned, we're going to give you an overview of the Catawba Watery and the Yadkin PD hydro projects. And this map that you're looking at here is the interbasin transfer map in North Carolina. And what I've outlined there is in yellow is the Catawba Basin, and in green is the Yadkin Basin. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those and how our projects operate on each of those basins. This is a more close-up view of that same of those same two basins. On the left is the Catawba Wateree Basin, which goes all the way from Lake James down through, which is in Morganton area, and down through Wateree, which is near Camden, South Carolina. There are 11 lakes, and you can see the various colors are defining the drainage basins for each of the lakes. And then on the right-hand side is the Yadkin Basin, and that is operated by 3 different operators. So there's the Carscott Dam at the very top. That is a Corps of Engineers project. And I should have mentioned before, the Catawba Wateree Basin is operated entirely by Duke Energy. It's one project, the Catawba Wateree project. So it's one basin, one operator. But what we have in the Yadkin Basin, we have 3 different operators. There's the Carscott Dam, which is the Corps of Engineers project. That is a flood control project. Does not have hydropower on that. Eagle Creek is the operator of the 4 hydros at the top of the basin. There, that area in blue, the very large area, is the drainage area for High Rock Lake. Tuckertown, Narrows, and Falls are the other 3 hydro projects in their under their purview. Eagle Creek used to be Cube Hydro. It was also Alcoa. So you've heard several different owners and operators for that particular project, but there are 4 hydro projects on that lake. And then Tillery is that purple, the drainage area for Tillery is that purple area, and then the drainage area for Blewett Falls is the green area. And on the right-hand side, we've listed some statistics for the basin. And one thing you'll notice is that the drainage area for the Catawba Wateree is a lot smaller than it is for the Yadkin PD. But the usable storage is much greater in the Catawba than it is in the Yadkin PD. And usable storage is defined as the critical reservoir elevation. It's the level of water, the amount of water above the critical reservoir elevation for each of the lakes. So critical reservoir elevation is the highest level of the water in the reservoir where any intake stops working. So if Lake Hickory has a water intake that's 10 feet down, and if any farther than that, it won't operate, then that's our critical reservoir elevation. On Lake James, there is no water intake, so its critical reservoir elevation is defined by the hydro station, and it's 54 feet. So we have 54 feet of water that we can use in James, and the amount of storage is different for each of the lakes. So that's an important thing to understand, is that usable storage is only the amount of water that you can use before you uncover an intake. And what you'll see is that the usable storage in the Catawba Wateree, even though it's a smaller basin, is much higher than it is in the Yadkin PD. And the reason for that is because of the impoundments and the size of the impoundments. So everything below Blewett Falls is straight free flow to the ocean. So there are no impoundments below Blewett Falls. And so that's the reason for the difference in the size of the usable storage. Also, in that lower graph, you have long-term mean flow. You'll see that it's much higher in the Yadkin Basin. So basically what it says is that there's a lot more water in the YPD, but there's a lot more usable storage in the Catawba Wateree. And so what regulates a hydro project? And the answer to that is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They are basically the regulatory authority for the Federal Power Act, and that requires each licensee to give equal consideration to power and non-power issues. So when we got the original license, I will note first, though, that the Catawba Wateree, the Yadkin project, and the Yadkin PD project are all regulated by FERC. the Corps of Engineers is not regulated by FERC. So all three of the projects were originally licensed in 1958, and they all received a 50-year license. And in that license was triggered by the construction of either a station or adding a new unit, which was the case at the Yadkin project. So that required us to get the original license. And that license expired in 2008 for all three of these projects. So we had to start the licensing process in early 2003. Eagle Creek started it in 2002. Began the relicensing process to get a new license before the old one expired. And we all three, at the time, the Yadkin PD project was owned and operated by Progress Energy, and Duke and Progress merged in 2012. So all three of these hydro projects started the relicensing process at the same time. We all did a stakeholder engagement process, which involved the public, and that allowed us to understand what the issues were for relicensing and what was important to the non-power interest for the resource, okay? And we all went through relicensing around the same time. We all submitted a new license to FERC in 2006 and developed comprehensive relicensing agreements and settlements agreements. And then the new license was issued for the Catawba in 2015 for 40 years. And for the Yadkin PD project in April of 2015 for 40 years. And then the Yadkin project, Eagle Creeks, came a little later in September of 2016. So it took a long time to get these licenses, and there were a lot of issues to consider, and we'll talk about those again in just a minute. But I'm going to give you kind of an overview of, I think, the Catawba Watery project. So as I mentioned earlier, it starts at Lake James in the Morganton area, and it goes down to Lake Watery in Camden, South Carolina. It covers 9 counties in North Carolina and 5 counties in South Carolina. It was the first river in the U.S. that was comprehensively planned and developed for electricity production. The lakes were built between 1904 and 63. The last one, the majority of them were built between 1904 and 1928. And then 1958, we applied for a license for Lake Norman, Cowens Ford Hydro Station, and that triggered the license requirement. But it became operational in 1963, and there are 11 lakes with approximately 80,000 surface acres and almost 1,800 miles of shoreline, and 255 billion gallons of usable water storage. And there's the usable storage again. So it's important to understand that usable storage piece. It supports Duke Energy's generating capacity in the Carolinas with 789 megawatts of clean, renewable, flexible hydropower. We generate approximately 1.5 million, well, so I don't know how you say that, 1.5 million megawatt hours per year. And that's about 118,000 homes that we can power with that much, that many megawatt hours. It's cooling water for fossil and nuclear, and it's fully integrated into the river community by providing drinking water for more than 2 million people. It is an industrial water supply for a number of industries, and 16 plus million recreation visits per year. That went up, way up, when COVID hit. So that's a very popular and a very important interest in this resource. And then we have 25,000 plus lake neighbors on the river, on the shorelines of these lakes. Most of the water storage is in 4 lakes, and that is Norman, James, Wiley, and Watery, and that encompasses 86% of the storage. Again, there's the 255 billion gallons total usable storage, which is about 7% of the annual average rainfall for the area. And all usable storage is important, but only after you get through the 4 big lakes, none of the rest of the lakes have more than about 4%. So they're very important, but they're a pass-through in a lot of cases. Let's see. And so what drives this this river system. It's rainfall. Because without rainfall, we don't have any water in this system, right? You'd be amazed how many people think you can turn on a valve and fill up the lake, but that's not what happens. It's Mother Nature and it's rainfall. And what you have here, these numbers are from 2023. And the system, as I said, is driven by rainfall, and that can be affected by climate change, both in both the high inflow and the low inflow areas. The red numbers are people directly affected, numbers that are directly affected by people. The blue numbers are Mother Nature. So that's no human control over the blue numbers. One thing to note is that the natural surface evaporation from all of these lakes on average is about 204 million gallons per day. And that is more than the total withdrawals from the people. So the total withdrawals from the people is about 202 million gallons per day. And the evaporation number, of course, it's going to be more in the summer, less in the winter, but on average about 204 million gallons per day. 46 inches of rainfall per year is about average here. So that's not a bad number. That's good. But rainfall drives this system. And I mentioned earlier the issues that we had to address during relicensing because the people were interested in these resources, right? And you can imagine back in 1958, when the original license was issued, there weren't a lot of environmental regulations, right? So when we went to relicense this project, we had to bring it up to speed with all of these environmental regulations. And that included addressing rare, threatened, and endangered species. Fish passage was a big one. Water quality was a big one. Other interests included recreation, land conservation, and future drinking water and industrial needs, as you can imagine. But we also had to balance all of that with the continued hydro generation with a modern license and support our thermal generation fleet. So there's a lot of interest in this resource. There were a lot of issues that we had to balance. And when we developed our comprehensive relicensing agreement, it addressed all of these issues and was signed by 70 parties. And it is basically incorporated into our license as a requirement for what we have to do going forward with our new license. And so what are some of the things that we have to do with our new license? Each of the 11 lakes now has a normal operating range. And Duke Energy has adopted a full pond elevation reference of 100 feet for each of its lakes. So that's full pond, 100 feet. And the reason we do that is because it's easier than remembering Lake Norman's full pond elevation is 760 and Wateree's is 225.5. And it's just easier for our operators and for the public to know that 100 feet is full. If it's 95, it's going to be 5 feet below full pond. And some people get confused and think that's a percentage, but it's not. It's foot for foot. So 100 feet is full, 95 is 5 feet down. And so with the new license, we have requirements for our 11 lakes to operate within a normal operating range, and that includes a normal max, which is always 100, and a normal minimum elevation, which varies from lake to lake, and it varies seasonally for some of the lakes as well. And each lake has a normal target elevation, and we are not required by our license to comply with that normal target elevation. That is an endeavor in good faith to meet that license requirement. And the targets were not made a license requirement because we have lake level variability and physically could not manage the 11 lakes to a specific target when you're optimizing the whole system. So this is a storage project. It's not a run-of-river project. If it was a run-of-river project, we would pass what comes in, we'd pass it downstream. So what goes in, what goes out. This is not a run-of-river project. It's a storage. So we're allowed to store the water so that we can use it when we need it. And operating between the min max allows us to meet and to store the water so that we can meet all the competing needs associated with the requirements of this license. This is an example of an operating range for our lake levels. This is Lake Norman's. And the green line is the full pond elevation. The blue is the minimum level. So the green is max, blue is level, and the red is the target elevation. And you'll see it's higher in the summertime for a lot of different reasons. One is so that we can store water. We can store more water because that's sometimes a dry season. And if it gets real dry, then we've got more water we can store or we can pull from. And it goes down in the wintertime. It allows people to work on their docks, but it also makes room for high inflows in the spring so that we have more storage to catch a lot of those high inflow events. So that one varies. Some of the lakes don't. Lake Wiley does not vary. It's 97 is the target, I believe, there all year long. And I can't remember if the men's 94 or 95. Do you remember, Phil? Okay. Anyway. Not all the lakes vary like this, but Lake Norman does, Lake James does, but majority of the lakes have a pretty constant operating range. We also have flow release and water quality requirements with the new license. There are bypass reaches at James, Great Falls that were previously dry unless it was a high inflow event. And those now have water in them all the time. So those are new continuous flows in the bypass reaches. We have higher continuous minimum flows at 6 of our developments. We also have minimum average daily flow releases at the developments where we do not have minimum continuous flow requirements. So we have flow release requirements at all of our developments now. We also have increased capabilities at aeration capabilities at our minimum continuous flow release sites. And we have new scheduled recreation flow releases at Bridgewater, Oxford, Wiley, Great Falls, and Wateree. And those are really popular. So that was a big interest that we had to address during the relicensing. And so how do we manage this? There's a lot of balancing that goes in when you're thinking about optimizing the system. So you're operating these 11 lakes, and in doing so, you've got to consider all the requirements at each of the lakes, right? All 12 of these hydro stations are operated remotely by the Regulated Renewable Operations Center in Charlotte, and the RROC, we call them, operates all of our hydro stations. So it's not just the Catawba, but they operate all of our hydro systems within North and South Carolina. And these stations can also be operated locally, but they're not staffed 24/7 anymore like they were back in the old days. But there are people there during the week that can operate these systems if they need to. But the majority of the time it happens from the RROC remotely in Charlotte. And factors that have to be considered in water management and electric generation are inflows from the tributaries and the upstream lakes. So they've got to make sure they know what's coming in, what needs to go out, required continuous daily average and recreation flow release requirements. We've got to balance the lake levels within the operating range and try to stay around the target. Maintenance of our hydro unit availability determines which units are available to operate and move water and which ones aren't. And then the Duke Energy customer demand and transmission system needs. So that's also very important because we've got to meet our demand. And the Energy Control Center, also in Charlotte, determines when generation is needed to support the grid. In the wintertime, the peak load is in the morning, and that's because everybody gets up and you turn up your heat and you start cooking breakfast and you're getting ready to go to school or work, wherever, and the demand goes up. So in the summertime, that peak load is in the evening when everybody goes home, turns their AC down, starts cooking, watching TV, whatever. So hydro supports those peak load demands. And the reason for that is because it can come on really quickly. So most hydro units can be brought online within 3 to 5 minutes. And that's what we use to balance the grid, if you will. So if we dropped, if one of our larger units came offline for some reason, tripped and had to go offline, then we could bring a hydro unit on very quickly to balance that load and balance that demand until we could get the big unit back on. So hydro serves a very important balancing support for our system demand, energy demand. And one thing we have to consider when we're moving all this water is how much water do we have? So during the relicensing process, we developed a low and flow protocol, and that is, it was basically designed to drive water use reductions and communication during drought periods. So Bill Fragapane on our staff checks the status of our low and flow protocol twice a month or just once a month? Twice a month. So at the beginning of the month and the 15th month, he's running the numbers to see where we are in the LIP. And it's implemented by the Catawba Watery Drought Management Advisory Group. And the members are public utilities, industry, resource agencies, and Duke Energy as the coordinator. The objective of this whole low and flow protocol is to slow down water use until it rains. So until we can get more water in the system, we've got to slow down how much we've taken out. And the management philosophy is that it's a shared resource, so we share the responsibility. And I would say that LIP is the single most important drought management tool that we have in the Catawba Watery River Basin. And the picture on the right, that is the Drought Monitor Index. This was from March of 25. And this is one of the things that we check every twice a month to see where it is. And what you see there in that picture is that North and South Carolina are in some stage of drought. The white is no drought, but the yellow is, what is it, Phil? Do you remember?
That's D0, and then the tan is D1, and that orange is D2. We even have some D2 in both states.
Yeah. So right now, North and South Carolina are both in some stage of drought. But that's not the only thing that we look at. So we also have to look at how much remaining usable water is in the reservoir, and that is the volume of water between the current reservoir elevation and each reservoir's critical elevation. So the blue line over there is the actual storage index, and I think I did this one in March or mid-March. So we're right on target. Anything below that yellow line is below target, so we would be approaching stage 0 at that point, or stage 1? Stage
0.
Stage 0. And then the farther down you go, the less remaining usable storage you have. So that's one of the things we check. We also check how much water is flowing into the reservoirs as measured in 4 different tributaries by USGS stream flow gauges. And then the drought monitor, which I explained to you on the previous slide, that's the third factor that we consider when evaluating whether we're entering a drought stage or if we're getting close to a drought stage. And I went through that pretty fast. I think that's probably a lot of information real quick, but at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, and she's going to talk about the Yadkin PD River Basin.
Thank you, Tammy. I will be brief on most of the slides because the information is very similar to what Tammy covered in detail. Very good job, Tammy. The Yadkin PD River Basin, which is also known as the YPD, you'll hear me say the YPD, it's shown on the map in the center of the slide. The YPD River Basin is the largest river basin in the Carolinas. It's providing drinking water to approximately 1.2 million people and also provides power to about 22,000 homes. Carscott Dam, which is located near Wilkesboro, is operated by the Corps of Engineers. And then further downstream are 4 hydroelectric dams owned and operated by Eagle Creek. As noted on the map by the yellow labels, the Tillery and Blewett Falls dams are owned and operated by Duke Energy. Next slide, Tammy. Just as the Catawba Watery River relicensing process, the YPD also experienced similar issues during the relicensing because of the interest in the resources. Just as Tammy mentioned, All of the items on this slide had to be addressed and balance those interests with the generation needs. All of those short-nosed sturgeon, the Atlantic sturgeon, all of those were studied, for rare and threatened, endangered species, and then other in-stream flow requirements. All of these issues listed on here were studied and issues during the relicensing process. Next slide. So when a new license is issued, there could be several new requirements or commitments regulated by FERC. For Tillery and Blewett Falls, new seasonal lake level and flow releases for aquatic habitat and recreation were implemented. As you can see on the slide, those lake level requirements for Tillery as well as Blewett Falls, and then the min flow requirements that are seasonal for Tillery and both Blewett Falls. You can see those requirements. The photos on the right side of the slide show where the dams and powerhouses are located at each station. Tillery is the photo on the top right, and got earthen dam on the left side. You have the dam, which contains 18 floodgates, and the powerhouse, which has 4 hydro turbines. In the photo at the bottom for Blewett Falls, you've got the powerhouse on the left, which has 6 generator turbines, and then the dam on the right, which contains Obermeyer gates on the spillway. Next slide, Tammy. Water management for the YPD is a balancing act, and it is much different than the Catawba Watery. As Tammy mentioned, Duke Energy owns and operates all the dams on the Catawba Watery. Water management on the YPD is largely dependent on upstream releases from Eagle Creek. These upstream releases, along with inflow from other tributaries, continuous flows and recreation flows, lake levels, maintenance concerns, and also customer demand, are all factors that are taken into consideration when developing generation plans. Supporting the system grid demand, which when we're outside of high inflow events, is normally met during the winter months in the morning and during the summer months in the evening. Next slide, Tammy. There are 4 different stages of the low inflow protocol. Tammy explained in a previous slide the low inflow protocol and its importance. Those stages are determined for the YPD. Those stages are determined based on High Rocks Lake elevation, the U.S. Drought Monitor status, which we have an example on the right of the U.S. Drought Monitor, and as well as 4 different stream gauges using the 3-month rolling average. The monthly status of the LIP can be found on Duke Energy's website at the address shown on the slide, and those are updated each month. And Tammy, I think that's all I have. I will now turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. So our lake levels, scheduled flow releases, and public recreation information is available on our website at dukeenergy.com/lakes. We also have a mobile app, Lakeview. We're actually in the process of upgrading that, so hopefully we'll see some improvements to that this year. And it has scheduled flow releases and lake levels. It does not have public recreation information on there yet, but we're hoping to get that added. And then we also have phone service. We have messages recorded on a phone line as well. So there's lots of ways to get information on lake levels and flow releases. I encourage you to download the app if you don't have it already. You can customize that to only give you information for the lakes that you're interested in, or you can see all of the lakes. And you can also get text messages whenever we post a special message. And we post special messages for high inflow events, if we're doing lake drawdowns for maintenance, if we're changing anything that's out of the norm, the way we're operating, then we post special messages on there. So it's a good way to keep in touch with what's happening at the lake you're interested in, or all of them if you're interested in that as well. And I believe that's all we have at this point. John, do you want to take it back, or do we have questions?
Sure, we can open it up if there are any questions specific to the information that Tammy and Lynn presented today. Happy to entertain those now. If you have a question, raise your hand. We will unmute you, or you can post it in the chat. Looks like Don has a question. And Don, you should be able to use your mic right now. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Hey, thanks, Tammy, for the presentation. I appreciate it. I did notice one thing I wanted to ask a question about was that you had mentioned you have an advisory group for the low inflow protocol as part of your relicensing. Is there
Yes.
a high inflow protocol that you also have?
We do not have a high inflow. The same. Let me get back to the presentation here. Can y'all see it?
Yes.
Okay, let me go back to that slide. As I mentioned, the use of the low inflow protocol is to communicate and keep track of where we are with the different lake levels and are we heading into a drought and that kind of thing. So high inflow events, that's interesting because they don't happen as slowly as a drought would happen. Okay, they're usually associated with a storm, and the forecast for that storm is only really accurate about 3 days out. So we have internal groups that we get together, and we're constantly looking at the weather, watching the weather. We have our own meteorology team, and that's what they do is they watch the weather for lots of different reasons. But high inflow is one of those, and we make a plan for managing the lake internally. That means, if we see some high inflow coming about 3 days out, we'll start making room by releasing water to create more storage so that we can catch this incoming water. And so all of that is done internally. We do communicate on the app and the Lakeview app and the website with special messages saying what we're doing. Noticing the people that, a high inflow event is coming and we're drawing the lakes down for this reason and get ready, move your furniture out of the way if it's going to get flooded and all that kind of good stuff. So all of that is done internally, but we do not, and Jeff might be online, he can elaborate on that a little bit, but we do not have a formal group external for high inflow events.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Tammy or Lynn about the material that they presented today?
John, we do have a question in the Q&A. It's from Ken Koth, and he's asking, what is the megawatt generation capability of Duke Energy stations on the Yadkin PD?
All right, let's go back to that. I think we have that on here. Average annual generation, 292 megawatt hours. Well, capacity, I'm sorry. Tillery is 84 megawatts, and Lynn, you may have to correct me, 84 megawatts, and Blewett Falls is 24. Is that right?
Blewett Falls is approximately 27.
84 and 27.
Okay, I think Brandon Jones has a question. Brandon, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to pose your question.
Great. Thank you. I'm just curious if y'all remember during the development of the low inflow protocol, was there a discussion about new users and a growing demand, whether that was rapid population growth, interbasin transfers, or new types of industry? In this case, like server farms. Was there a discussion about how that drought management would be proportioned for all those new users, or was that talked about?
So I was not involved in that. Is Jeff on? Jeff Lineberger? You might have to unmute him. I think he was planning to join us. Brett, can y'all see if Jeff's on?
Yeah, Jeff is on, and Jeff, I think you should be able to unmute yourself if you can speak to that.
Okay, can y'all hear me?
We can.
Yeah, and Brandon, I didn't exactly follow your question about new users, but you know, as new water intakes are put in, or you know, if there was a new withdrawer from one of the Duke Energy reservoirs, one of the conditions of that withdrawal approval would be that they have to comply with the low inflow protocol. If that's getting at your question, but I might have missed the question.
Yeah, I guess I was just making sure. So the thought is that as new users come on, they will take an equal proportion of that. So it wouldn't be like, if you were there in the past, you had this much proportion, and new users would have to, tighten down more or less. Everybody that's withdrawing is going to be using the same standards and have to tighten up their belt the same
That is
amount.
correct. Yeah,
Okay,
that is
great.
correct. The whole purpose, the whole intent of the low inflow protocol is to buy time. You know, when you're in a drought, you can't conserve your way out of the drought. It has to actually start raining again. But what you can do is slow down how fast the water is leaving the reservoir system. And all users are expected to do that as we get into these increasing stages of the low inflow protocol. You tighten your belt more and more to buy time for the rains to come and the stream flows to improve and improve the water inventory.
Okay, there was a question in the Q&A from Edgar Miller. What would the impact be of the proposed IBT on the LIP on the Catawba?
Yep. And I think, John, I posted an answer, but I will read it for the group as well. Edgar asks, what's the impact of the proposed IBT on the LIP? And it's a good question. And it's a question we have not yet answered, but it will be answered in the coming months. And that information will be coming to the stakeholder advisory group during one of our in-person meetings in the coming months.
Any other questions for Tammy or Lynn from the SAG participants? All right, if not, I want to thank everybody for their time. Again, thank you, Tammy and Lynn. Tammy, happy retirement. Thank you for this presentation, very informative. Again, our next webinar, the third webinar, is still scheduled for Wednesday, April 23rd. That will be Linwood Peel from DEQ Division of Water Resources. He's going to talk about IBT process and regulations. We hope to be reaching out to the stakeholder advisory group sometime in the next several weeks with more information on additional webinars beyond that third one for late April. And then also tentatively to select a date for our next in-person workshop. Right now, we're targeting the end of May, but we'll have some discussion and figure out what day we're really looking for. So look for some further communication with that. Jennifer, anything else you'd like to add, or Angela? Nope.
Nope.
All right.
Thank you to our speakers today, and thank you for you all for participating.